So, on this episode, we're going to be talking about Christians and the working class. That's coming up. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. So what's the role of the church when it comes to the working class? And that's been a question I've been asking for a long time. And for me, it's rather personal. You see, both of my parents were auto workers in Flint, Michigan. They were both members of the United Auto Workers. And actually, that was the case with many of my relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, were all worked in one of the many GM plants in the area. Now, I didn't grow up, I'm not these days working class, but I grew up working class. And I've always wondered if churches, especially mainline Protestant churches, have an interest in responding and connecting with those people who don't have a college degree. Now, as long as I've had this question on my mind, it's been hard to find someone with a church background that could credibly talk about this issue. And today I can actually say I finally found someone. I had to go outside of the United States to find him, but I did find him. Today I am talking with Brian Dijkema. He is the Canadian president of Cardus, which is a nonpartisan Christian think tank. What I mean that he is the Canadian president is because they also have a U.S. president. It's a binational organization. He regularly works with municipal, state, provincial, and federal governments on both sides of the border, as well as civil servants on a wide range of policy issues. When he's not doing the work with Cardus, he's also a senior editor for Comment magazine, which I will say, because I have read it, it's a great magazine. His writings have also appeared in several publications, including the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Toronto Star. And he lives in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, with his wife and 4 children. I think that this is going to be a good conversation. We also kind of lean into talking a little bit about kind of the role of I guess what I would say is it's maybe a thick church in how it relates to the wider society. And when I talk about that, it's relating to something that was brought up by Jonathan Rauch in his latest book, Cross Purposes, where he talks about different churches and how different types of Christians and how they relate in culture. So that will show up in the conversation. But I hope that you will join me in this very important conversation with Brian Dijkema. Well, Brian, thank you for coming on to talk to me today. I think I wanted to start off by knowing a little bit about you. So, your faith background and where you grew up, and also where you're currently working.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I mean that. Thank you so much. I'm always happy to engage in cross-border relations with my American brothers and sisters. So it's always good to see this. My name is Brian Dijkema. I grew up in Eastern Ontario, small town Eastern Ontario, in a place called Brockville. Population 21,000 and has been 21,000 for a long time. Which is a small manufacturing town, actually. And so some of the stuff we'll talk about on the working class is certainly part of the story of my town growing up. I grew up with, I have three sisters, two great parents, had a good household, working class family. My mom worked for at home for most of her life, and then became an ECE, an early childhood educator at a Montessori school. And my dad's a land surveyor, so he's the kind of guy who goes around with the transit and into the bush and other places, doing, making sure that land titles are legal and all that stuff. So always enjoyed hearing stories from my dad working. Like I said, I come from an immigrant family. My mom immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands. My dad is born to Dutch parents, and again, that's part of the story. Our story in the Netherlands, my family was sort of bourgeoisie, petite bourgeoisie. They're sort of like doctors and that type of thing. My grandpa studied agriculture, came over here to Canada, and worked in both agriculture and in the factories of Black and Decker, which is, I think Black and Decker is still around. It's a factory, makes drills and stuff like that. So that's a bit of my background. I currently live in Hamilton, Ontario, which is again a very it's for Americans it's like Pittsburgh, but more Canadian. And I mean, our football teams even have similar colored jerseys. We're both steel towns. It's and has escarpments and stuff like that. I think two towns that would know the word funicular. So that's currently where I live, in Hamilton, with my wife and four children. And I'm a Christian. I grew up Christian Reformed. Am still Christian Reformed. We spent a little bit of time in the Anglican Church when we were in Ottawa, which I love the liturgy. But that's a bit of a glimpse into who I am.
Okay. And just kind of as an aside, you mentioned living in Hamilton, which is also the sister city of my hometown, Flint, Michigan, which for years, I don't even know if they still do it, had the Canusa games, of the games between our two towns. So yeah.
That's amazing. So I'll tell you one story. My daughter and son, this is amazing. I'm like very familiar with the Canusa games. My daughter and son both played in the Canusa games for Hamilton in soccer. So
okay.
We're very familiar with Flint and with, a bunch of teams. Actually, they came up, it was 2 years ago. They came up, last year we were in Flint, but,
okay.
2 years ago they came up here, and it was great. I love that. It's one of those things, tensions are high between our two countries. They needn't be. My hope is that they stop being that way. I think America is one of the greatest countries in the world. But the Canusa games is just classic. It's a bunch of kids playing sports, and it's just good time. So I'm glad that's so cool that you know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been kind of a fun little thing of that kind of international cooperation between these two towns, and towns that are very similar in some ways, because they're both kind of manufacturing working class towns. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah, for sure. Less so today though. Like Hamilton is a different town than it was back in the day. And you can see that just in its sort of economic makeup and stuff like that. But Canusa games is quality, just good times. You can't beat it. A bunch of kids coming up and competing hard, and just at the end of the day, living with each other. And it's just, it's the best stuff. It's the best stuff.
So I wanted to actually, one of the reasons I had wanted to talk to you is really about the role of faith in the role of kind of the working class and also the labor movement. And one of the reasons that I have an interest in this is because I've always kind of wondered, especially within the church, do we have that strong role for the working class? And at least here in the States, even among kind of more mainline Protestant churches, it doesn't always seem like that there's really an interest in the lives of people who kind of work either in kind of working class, blue collar backgrounds. Not that people don't care, but it's just that it just doesn't seem to factor in as much. I'm kind of curious, has that been the case in Canada? And how have churches dealt with it currently? And then I will kind of want to talk about that in the past, because I think hearing you on another podcast, the church actually had a pretty strong role, especially in the labor movement in Canada. And I wanted to kind of talk to you about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, but first let's take a moment to do the classic. I work for a think tank, so I'm going to do the classic think tank thing here, Dennis, and say let's define our terms. And um, so we actually have done some work on the working class. So I will say, politically, culturally, working class is one of those things that people use whenever they want to use it. You know
This
what
is
I mean?
true. Yeah.
It's sort of like, this person could be working class. If they're sort of living in a suburb, they're working class. The way we define working class is people who work in jobs that don't require university or tertiary degree. So,
Hmm.
and I actually think that's a really helpful way of defining it. So, if you're a doctor, sorry, you're not working class. If you're a lawyer, I'm sorry, you're not working class. Accountant, etc. Now, people might think that way because they don't earn a ton of money, and they'll say, "Look, I'm not a billionaire. There's no way I'm the upper class." Well, we're just saying, look, if you're that, you're in the professional class, and that's a different suite of policies will affect you, a different sort of cultural milieu. You've gone through university, and so we define working class as jobs that don't require that. So things like um, if you work in a hotel, or if you work as a server in a restaurant, or maybe you're a laborer on a construction site, a
Hmm.
laborer, as opposed to an electrician, for instance, who does have a ticket usually, which is sort of on the edge of you went to college, usually go to college, or you've done an apprenticeship and had to go to do that. So those jobs that don't require a tertiary degree. And what's been clear in both Canada and the US is that there has been a growing divide between those types of jobs and those people who have had those tertiary degrees. If you've got a
Hmm.
tertiary degree, you're doing pretty well for yourself, generally, I would say. Now, not always. There's questions of inflation. Inflation affects everybody. It affects working class worse. Um, but if you've got a university degree, generally you've done pretty well. And what's interesting, Dennis, is that holds across other vulnerable groups. So, like if you look in Canada, the indigenous population. We did a study on the employment picture of Indigenous Canadians. As you know, it's an ongoing issue in Canada that we are seeking reconciliation with the Indigenous communities, between the Crown and Indigenous communities, and actually trying to economic reconciliation is part of that effort. And we did a study on, like, well, how are Indigenous people doing when it comes to employment? And generally, it's a bleak picture. It's a bleak picture. And there are
Hmm.
two bright lights. Is if you've got a university degree, if you're an Indigenous person with a university degree, you actually do better than the average Canadian with a university degree. And so, what's fascinating is it appears to be that's doing a lot of work. And I would say that that's true across the board culturally in a number of other ways.
Hmm.
Um, so that's sort of how I would define the working class. So that's long, but it's helpful.
Hmm.
So then the question becomes, well, how does the church relate to that working class? And I'd say it's complicated.
Hmm.
There's a beautiful Coen Brothers film where there's got this guy with an American accent, and the British guy's like trying to get him to say, "Would that it were so simple," and they end up just going with, "It's complicated." And I say it's complicated when it comes to the working class. Um, I'd say we'll talk historically. Right now, there's sort of two things going on. Religion, if you look at it, has among the working class is a bit on the decline, actually.
Hmm.
Religion, like particularly Christianity, people used to, when I was a teenager, people used to make fun of Christians for being the dumb idiots who were uneducated and believed in all this gobbledygook about some god who rose from the dead and he was born of a virgin, right? Like you're the idiots. That's just not true anymore. Increasingly, religion is something, particularly practicing Christians come from a higher educated population. They tend to be more educated. So what has happened is, over time, the percentage of people in the working class who would fit that definition have the percentage of those people who go to church on a regular basis, who are spiritually active in churches, has declined. Now,
Hmm.
there's nuances to this story. Pentecostalism has been a major force in the working class. Some of the non-denominational churches, it continues to be in immigrant populations. Catholicism continues to be a place where you're more likely to see working class people. But I would say there is a challenge in the church in Canada and in the U.S. On speaking to those who are in that definition that we gave earlier.
Why do you think that there is that challenge? It seems like there is, at least in the churches that I've been a part of, I will see a lot of people from more professional classes, but not people, very few people from the working class. And what is it that it seems like the church isn't reaching out, or isn't, that some parts of the church, I shouldn't say all the church, but isn't why is it that they're not seeming to connect?
You know, Dennis, that's the question that I wish I had a quick like bang answer for you there. I don't have one. I can do some speculation and trying to help understand the what some of the data say. And one is that I do think there's been one of the things that we've noticed in the sort of social environment is a moving away of classes from each other. So if you're a university educated person, you kind of just only associate with university educated people, and you get used to that. That forms habits. You become less comfortable around other people. And then when you become less comfortable with other people, those people feel less comfortable around you. When I go into like a place like the Fairmont Chateau, you feel uncomfortable because you're like, I don't belong here. I'm a working class kid from Brockville. And so I do think there's a slight element of that, Dennis, that it's just a class comfort thing. People like to be around. So, and there's lots of evidence on that with sorting, sort of what they call sort of educational sorting, that people just sort of talk to one another. And that's a huge loss in my opinion. I actually think the church, and I think it still is more so the place, than any other institution where you'll see people from across, class lines actually being together. My church in Hamilton, for instance, is a lot of educated people. We're close to a university, so there's lots of educated people, and that's increasingly Hamilton's population. But, still working class people coming around. And it's one of the very few places, other than maybe a hockey game or a sports game, where you have someone with a university degree and somebody who's pulling wire in the same place. So, that would be one thing. The other is, I do think there has been, and this is very complicated about the expansion of the welfare state and other things like that. But, if you're in the working class, there are some like material needs sometimes that you have. And I'm not saying like a lot of working class people are also upwardly mobile. I think one of the things that many people get, in mind, this is working class. It's like, we can't think of the working class today in the same way that Leo the 13th was talking about it in Rerum Novarum, or Abraham Kuyper was talking about it in his sort of message to the Christian Social Congress. It's different days. And we should actually talk a little bit about, Kuyper and Leo the 13th and the Catholic and Reformed social movements, as well as some of the other ones in Canada with Wordsworth and Tommy Douglas and stuff, which I'm sure we'll get to. But it's not that way today. Like working class people want to move up. And I think one of the things that we've seen, at least in the economic data that I've studied, is that like networks are actually really important for that. And, but that's all sociological stuff, Dennis. Theologically, I don't have a strong case of why it is that there's a sort of failure to do that. I would say in places where you do see working class, growth in churches, it tends to involve a few things. One is clear preaching and actually high standards. One of the things that is like high moral standards. So if you look at sort of major Pentecostal movements in Mexico or Latin America, often it's poorer people in working class, and they are growing with a couple of things. They tend to have very high moral standards: no drinking, no smoking, no screwing around on your wife, right? Like none of that stuff. And they're very clear about it. And so that holds true in Canada too. I don't know as much in the States, but there tends to be a sort of clarity in terms of the message of what the church is preaching. A real strong sense of like that you're valued, that Jesus loves you. I mean, some of the stuff, Dennis, is like, just preach the gospel.
Hmm.
Like uh, preach the gospel and they'll grow. I listened to a podcast recently by Jonathan Rauch, who's a great, really great
Hmm.
guy, works for Brookings. And he had an interview with Russ Roberts, who's an economist from Stanford. I think he's at Shalem College in
Hmm.
Jerusalem right now.
In Jerusalem.
And those two were talking about the need for a sort of Christianity as a part of a cohesive part of a democratic governance and democratic polity. And what Jonathan was talking about was a need for a thick Christianity, sort of like high standards. Like, don't just be the culture, demand something from the culture. And that's how, demand something from yourself, but also thick community. And I think that's another thing that has been present in the past. And if there's a need for bringing people together, it's actually thick community. And that applies to the working class as much as anybody else. It's one of those things, like, I want to be very careful to not say the working class are some specimen over here, that they're human beings too. And often there's higher degrees of overlap in terms of concerns and so on.
Mhm.
But that's a bit of a long winded answer to your question, but hopefully it provides a bit of insight.
It does. And the fact that you mentioned Ram Navaram and Abraham Kuyper, you're speaking my language.
It's good
Because, yeah, I
language.
mean, those have been things that have always been interesting to me. And I think if I were in another country, I probably would be a Christian Democrat of some type. Um, just because that ethos has been kind of something that I've been shaped by. Um,
Well, just a little shout out. There is one in the States called the Christian Solidarity Party.
mhm.
I think they're new. I'm not American, so I don't vote in your elections, and I trust you, the
Mhm.
American people, to take care of their own polity. But you're right. Like, that is the sort of vision that they would hold on to.
Yeah. So, but it does actually lead into something about um, labor and the church. And I was actually listening to you on the Lean Out podcast with Tara Headley, and I think what was fascinating for me to know, and I'd known some things about like the beginnings of, let's say, the New Democratic Party and its the CCF. But what I was surprised by was the religious background of many of the founders, um, and how much of a role faith played in that party and the unions. And we talked a little bit before the podcast about um, a union, a kind of an independent union that is also a very Christian union. We don't hear much about the role of the church when it comes to that. And I'd love to hear you share that part of that story, because I think that's important for people to know that.
Sure, sure. Well, I just want to correct myself. I said Christian Solidarity Party. They're actually the American Solidarity Party. So
You're
that's
right. Yeah.
and I think their thing is a pelican. Good, so good on
Hmm.
them. Anyway, but the point is, to your question, the precursor of the NDP,
Hmm.
which is the New Democratic Party of Canada, NDP, which, by the way, right now is cratering in the
Hmm.
polls. We're about to go to the polls on April 28th, so 5 days from now. And it looks like they're going to get their butts whipped, to turn a Canadian phrase. And and one of the things that I said on the Tara's podcast, Lean Out, which is a great podcast, which I recommend
Hmm.
to your listeners, is the cratering of the NDP vote. And one of the reasons why is the NDP has largely lost its working class base. The NDP, and I would say this is true, by the way, for the Democratic Party in the States. I think there are parallels here. They basically have become the party of sort of an academic professional elite, with certain cultural assumptions about identity and so on, that are more libertarian in nature, in the sense of, like, you do you and we're not going to judge, but we're going to use the state, to make sure that you can do you. And they've sort of bought into a sort of academic, and I would say professional class, activist group. And in doing so, they've lost the working class people, the people who worked in factories, mines, people who work in long-term care homes, the very people who used to be the base, and for whom they still purport to be speaking. But they don't vote for them anymore. They don't speak for them anymore. And I think the fact that many of these workers have sort of been listening to the NDP's message and said, well, you're not representing me at all. You're not representing me, my family, my interests, my ambitions. I sort of say that they sort of rely upon a sort of trickle down statism. It's sort of like the opposite of the supply side. It's like they're sort of two mirror or two sides of the same coin. And I think, those workers have largely left. And what's surprising is that that is actually a departure from the roots of the New Democratic Party. So the New Democratic Party's precursor was something called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And there's something in both of those things, the cooperative nature, that there was an understanding early on that it's like people coming together to do things together. It took the state sometimes, but there was a higher value on local community doing things locally. So if you go to the prairies, and it was really started in the Canadian prairies, they were actually quite a populist party in some way. And so there's again echoes, Trump got elected on the working class vote and immigrant vote. That's what brought him in. So there's hints of that populism. But what they did was say, hey, wait a minute. This is in the time where we were talking about earlier with the sort of creation of the various labor regimes. Very brutal. The Winnipeg General Strike took place, and things were not great for the working class. And so you had people like J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas, who are the sort of two most famous of the founders, or two most famous names associated with the CCF and the NDP. And what people don't talk about these days is the role that faith played. And that's what you're picking up on, Dennis. It's like Tommy Douglas was a Methodist preacher. He was a Methodist minister, came from the Methodist Church. Oh, sorry, J.S. Woodsworth was. Tommy Douglas was actually Baptist, ordained in a Baptist church, went to a Baptist school. And there was definitely their Christian teaching, their Christian architecture, mental architecture, understanding of social architecture was deeply, deeply affected by Scripture, by the church's teaching. And that was the motivation for them to get out there and to do things. There's a really great quote. I don't know if it's a quote. I'm not going to quote because it's always dangerous. But there's a great, Woodsworth or Tommy Douglas. Sorry, he sort of saw the stuff that was happening in the Depression, and he saw the Salvation Army was out there. He's like, wow, these people are actually doing stuff. The Salvation Army would get out there, feed people, clothe them, give them blankets and stuff like that. But then it was gone. At the end of the day, it was gone. They're like, we got no more food. We can't do anything for you. And there was that he was seeing. And then he was seeing the Marxists and the Leninists, the sort of let's have a cultural revolution, quoting Marx and Lenin and sitting there about the need for cultural revolution and not doing bupkis, and he's like, no, this is not right. The gospel's got to apply. It's got to happen here. And so that was true for Woodsworth as well. The sort of looking at the challenges being faced by the working class population and saying we need to do something about it as Christians. Now, I'll pause and say, because I'd love to talk about this too, because I think it has implications for our current time. Is they both had challenges with doctrine. So what I find fascinating is both Woodsworth and Douglas were like, we're Christian. I'm not sure about that whole resurrection thing. So there's even from the beginning, there's sort of a how much is the gospel here and how much is it social has always been one of the challenges. And that would be sort of an example of it was like leaven. Christianity was like a leaven to their work. But whether or not that yeast was alive and could stay alive with some of their commitments was another question, and may have contributed, I think, over time to the decline of both of those movements, and maybe even a decline in some of the mainline churches from which they came from. But that's a different story altogether.
But that's not unlike some parts of the social gospel here in the States with Walter Rauschenbusch, and that was kind of the same issue there too. So
exactly,
not that different.
No, exactly, Dennis. It's the same story, and it's one that I find I'm pretty politically agnostic. I work for a think tank that's nonpartisan. I want good policy, and I want good policy that's based on Christian social principles. That's what I do. So I'm not we've done work with the NDP that's been supportive of us on payday loans. For instance, we've done some stuff on payday lending, and but we're generally thought of as conservative in Canada, and I have no problem with identifying with that, because we actually hold on to some of those things. Like, we actually think Jesus is risen from the dead. We're what, 3 days after Easter. I'm like,
Yeah.
and I'm still reveling in it. Like I'm still reveling in it. It's true. Let's live like it's true, And I think if you look at the greatest movements in Christianity, they've always been, I'm just going to pause here. Do I have you back? Yeah, sorry about that. There's a glitch there. So I'll start again so you can edit it. But if you look at the greatest movements in Christianity, it's always been a marriage of sort of deep orthodoxy, strong piety, with a recognition that we got to do something for those who are the least. And you go way back. Let's go to the way back machine. We'll go to Basil of Caesarea, the Gregories, their sister, who was maybe more influential. And it was no, we got to take the babies out of the dumps and we got to pick them up. And the people who are dying, everyone else is fleeing because of the plague. We're staying here and taking care of them. Now, these were literally church fathers and mothers in the case of Macrina. I think I'm getting her name right. And there's no one's going to accuse them of sliding into liberalism or backsliding into liberalism or whatever you want to call it. But that's true across the board. That's true across the board. You saw that with Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. Abraham Kuyper was seen as a conservative in his church in one way, but also highly active socially, saying so one of the fathers of the Dutch trade unions, which is now the CNV, I won't even try to pronounce it. I'm afraid my French is better than my Dutch. So, but I think that's the challenge, and that's the stuff that Jonathan Rauch in that conversation with Russ Roberts is talking about, a thick Christianity. And I think at a time of major dissolution, a major polarization, and I think real challenges for working class people economically, in many ways the church, it's an opportunity for it. And I would say there is actually lots of it going on. You don't see tons of it, but if you look around, it's there. We did a project at Cardus called the Halo Project that looked at the effects of churches. We also included mosques and synagogues, but the reality is in Canada, the majority of religious communities are Christian still. And I think that would be true in the States. We actually based it upon an American study. And it looked at the effect of a church budget. And actually, for every dollar spent by a church, there is a massive multiplier in terms of the social benefit. And that's that's for stuff like hosting AA groups. That's for, food banks, food kitchens that are run out of churches. That's for help with moms, daycare, childcare, stuff like that. So, I think we can go get real negative, and say we're churches failing. And I say, yeah, sometimes it is. It's putting its focus somewhere else, maybe too much on politics. Maybe it's putting its faith on a sort of an other world without recognizing that the Easter message matters right now, which is something that I think we would hold in common, even with some of those folks like Wordsworth, who sort of slipped away from that over the course of their life. But I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for the church, it's a challenge for real. But that's just always been the nature of the Christian message. It's been both salvation from your sins and liberation from debt. It's debt of sin and debt of debt. Sometimes there's a great organization that our church works called Christians Against Poverty. They're just owning it. And they literally, their job is to get people out of debt, whether it's credit card debt or payday loan debt or whatever. And it's for me, that's the heart of the message. It's you're indebted and you're in deep trouble economically. We're going to help you get out of that hole. And often that stuff is accompanied by you're deep in sin, whether it's your own, pursuing your own whatever. And the liberation comes on both ends. And anyway, I'm waxing here. I'll take a pause.
But I think that leads into something that I'm kind of curious about is today, as we're kind of dealing with on both sides of the border of I think political parties that maybe not as focused or focus more on kind of you do you and not on liberation in all of its forms, and what it's kind of the result of that is, how do you kind of get, is there a way back? Is there a way to kind of reform and have a movement that is concerned about people, kind of the whole, I guess for lack of a better word, the whole gospel, that I feel sometimes isn't there.
Yeah, I mean, look, the political parties' relationship to faith communities in both Canada and the U.S. has generally been marked by use. Like I would say, there's a desire to see it as a sort of a group, an interest group, and we can use them. I would say that's true in Canada as much as anywhere else. Now, I will also say there are sometimes shrewd and thoughtful people who are practicing statecraft as Christians who are making compromises on both sides. It's this, I'm not a like, there is the story of Daniel in the Bible, and there's the story of Naaman in the Bible, who are high political offices. And clearly Daniel, the Ian Shugart, who is the clerk of the Privy Council here in Canada, one of the sort of highest ranking civil servant, used to talk about his role as being one of a Daniel, because he'd look at it and he says, like, he's the head of the soothsayers, the seers, the astrologers, etc. He's like basically he's deputy minister of the occult, right? So like clearly the man had to be shrewd, and the Christian word we use for this in politics is prudence. He'd have to use prudence to make calls on when we have to hold the line. When is this is an acceptable compromise? Everybody does that. Everybody does that in politics. Politics in a democracy consists of that. So I'm not saying, everyone has to be perfect before you work with them. But I would say, like, what are you getting out of this? And I think, like, for those Christians who are either evangelicals who actually believe the full story of the gospel, or John Paul II Catholics, for instance, who are conservative theologically and, still want to see the universal destination of all goods, that those types of things that Catholic teaching teaches, pro-trade union, etc. I'd say, like, we're really, and especially this is true in the States right now, they're sort of like, we're aliens, we're outside. Like no one really cares about us. We're a little too weird for everybody. And I think that's okay. Like, I think that's okay. And I think there's a sense in which, you gotta own, we had an article in Comment Magazine, which is a magazine that we publish, comment.org for your listeners. You should go check it out. This, is called Make Christianity Weird Again. And, part of that is like, a lot of people get all uptight about our positions on various things. I'm like, well, it's, guys, you do believe, we start with like, Jesus was born of a virgin. It's like the rest of the stuff you're worried about that, but we're talking, so, but I think it's like one of those situations where the churches that, like, Benedict XVI says, if you marry the spirit of this age, you're going to be divorced in the next. You're going to be alone in the next. And I think that's true for whether you're on the right or the left. And, at the end of the day, it's the gospel. It's the gospel. That's the thing that's eternal, And, so I'm just like, lean into it and get involved in politics. If you're a Republican, get involved. Like I chatted with some, of the members of your legislature who are like serious Christian people, and they're involved and they're thoughtful. They're doing the work. They're trying to do that stuff. And I'm like, more amen to that. We need more of that. And I'd say on both sides of the borders, but you need to, on both, and I mean political partisan border, like, but I think this is one of the challenges. One of the things that the left needs to do in the States, and I think it's true in Canada, is like try to understand that they need to be okay with the weirdness of some Christians. And, like Jonathan Rauch, again, really, really thoughtfully said, I kind of made the mistake. I kind of celebrated the removal of serious, thoughtful Orthodox Christians from public square, because I'm like, yeah, we won. And he's like, actually, we kind of needed that voice. Um, and I think that's true. I think Ross Dow, the New York Times columnist, has said, like, look, if you didn't like the religious right, just wait for the non-religious right.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, I don't want to wait for that because I'm not interested in it at all. And I think we've seen a little bit of what has happened with that on the left, where the left is actually a little bit further ahead. They've gone fully, religion doesn't have much of a role to play in the left at this point. There's very, very hostile, very skeptical towards them. And I think as they've done that, they've actually lost, credibility and standing politically. And so the question then becomes, what path forward is there for them to come to an understanding? And I think there is a path. I think people like Michael Ware, who used to work for Obama, are trying to chart that path, like taking seriously the orthodoxy of their faith and saying, look, we're going to try to do this here. But I think it needs to happen on both sides, because if you think the right's winning at this point, the thing with democracy is you got 10 years and you're going to lose at some point. That's the nature of it. And it's sort of like, govern others as you would have them govern you. And I think that if that's the heart of the message, it's like govern others according to the way that the church has taught through the ages. And I think, I love little parties and stuff like that. I think the American Solidarity Party is an example of like a party that doesn't quite fit. Their policies don't quite fit. And I'm just waiting for the day that Democrats and Republicans just start stealing their policies. But we'll see. We'll see how that all goes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that matters to me right now is in thinking about what Jonathan Rauch has talked about is he's talked about different types of Christianities, and one that he talks about a lot is thin Christianity, and how you have sometimes, and I think this definitely fits mainline Protestantism in that it has become so secularized in some ways that it doesn't really have much to say to the wider culture, and I think that has weakened the church in a lot of different ways, to really be able to speak in a way that has some sense of force. That I think right now it's made so many accommodations to the wider society that when the voice it speaks, basically sometimes it's just basically parroting kind of left-wing talking points, so that it doesn't really have a distinctive voice. And by that matter, it doesn't have an authoritative voice, which I think is very different from, say, at least from my context, the civil rights movement, when the church did have very much an authoritative voice, because it wasn't simply just parroting talking points from a political party.
Yeah, Dennis, I think that's really wise. And I think that's like, if you brought me on because I'm Canadian and bring some of that, is like, that's absolutely the case with our three big mainline, the Anglican Church of Canada, United Church of Canada, which is a merger of the Anglicans, Methodists, and Presbyterians, and then the Presbyterian Church of Canada. Both are like hitting demographic cliffs. They won't be here in 20 years at the rate they're going. And the reality is that when it comes to politics, we jokingly, but I think accurately, refer to them as just baptizing the left's policy and not having any distinctive voice. And I think that's been to their detriment, to be honest, because the church's political witness is part of its witness. It's not the only thing, but it is part of its witness. And your allusion to the black churches and the civil rights movement is, I think, where we should be looking. Like, to be honest, like, in Comment Magazine, again, I'm going to refer to an article by Angel Adams Parham, who talked about the black church and its role. And I look at that, I'm like, yeah, okay, here's a people who know, and who are willing to do the work. You talk about cooperative, the work that it takes to get, for me, Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the lesser gods in the pantheon of, along with, Abraham Kuyper and John Paul II. For me, he's like, and just look at that work. And it's not just him. It was not just him. He's the face, but like the work it took of churches, prayer, marches, and the massive effect that had on American public life for the good, and I would say for the eternal good. and to the credit of your nation. So if you're looking for a place to start, I'm like, go to a black church in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that's like, and I, like, so for me, I've always thought that it weird, the sort of, I think it's true that there is a sort of divide, but it's like, perhaps that's the yeast that's still alive, and I would say, like, it's not the only one. There's lots of, like, look, I go to a Christian Reformed church. We've got our own challenges, but there are those that are alive, and those that are most alive are those that, practice, strong orthodoxy and strong social action in their community. They love their neighbors as themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's a way in which you could find this beautiful solidarity amongst Christians who have more in common with the blood of Christ than the differences they have with either their skin color or their class. And that for me is that's what motivates me to do my work. Honestly, Dennis, it's like, at the end of the day, I think, Christ is risen from the dead. And I don't talk about this in my public policy stuff. I talk about it with other Christians, but like, there's Leslie Newbegin, who's an Anglican missionary. Someone asked him, like, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And, this is a good question to be asking ourselves right now given the state
right
of our both of our societies, and his answer was like, I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And I'm like, amen.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking for churches that believe that. And I think that the black church has been one of the strongest examples of that in American history. I think it remains so. It has its own challenges too. But for me, it's like, let's find that, the people who are focused on that hope of the resurrection and how it makes things change right now, in your life, in your community, in your neighborhood, with your next door neighbor. And that's like, that may be a long project, Dennis. That's the thing. Like, working for a political, or a think tank that often is seen as political, doing policy, is like, I like to win. I like to get policy wins. I love it. I love to win. Who doesn't love to win? But Christianity is a long project. Christianity is a long project. If we're on the decline, as I think we are, you have to say to yourself, what's it going to take to fix it? And I think it's going to take a long time and a lot of hard work. But I think the way to do it is to look through that question of what Newbegin said.
I think that kind of leads to a question about the times that we are in, because I think one of the things that I find fascinating and the sense of wanting to see things that are happening and do something, but I think sometimes it's how, especially churches, and especially on the more liberal end, have been in some ways almost divorced from the faith, or the faith is kind of how can I put this? Kind of a cheerleader for whatever causes that you're in. So how do you develop a faith that is really grounded and is there for the long haul and is there to work for the transformation of society, and not just, to support government programs, but really for the transformation of society all around, in people's hearts, but also outside of the walls of the church?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at there is a question of how do we form people to be integrated Christians. It's
exactly.
There's a lot of talk about integralism and all that stuff too. And as much as I'm doubtful of any project to establish Catholicism as the sort of established religion of the States, I'm doubtful and not sympathetic towards that. But on the question of, like, do you want a nation? You guys are a republic. We're a monarchy. But at the end of the day, we're both democracies. And democracies are only as good as the formation of their citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And the same, I always say democracy came first in the church. There's historically and theoretically, democracy was present in the church prior to it being present in the states and in the state. And, the Greeks can eat their heart out, as far as I'm concerned, the ancient Greeks. But that question is like, how do you form people to be the type of people who who take the gospel seriously in all aspects. And that's the hard work, Dennis. That's the hard work. Like, that's like, if you're a pastor, that means you've got to be teaching, but you've not only got to be teaching intellectually, you've got to be forming people physically. Things like fasting, things like giving, things like helping your neighbor out, your actual neighbor, like loving your actual neighbor. Like, and I mean that by like, do you know your next door neighbor? Do you know their concerns? Do you know their, like, do you know the poor people in your city? Like, do you know, like, are you helping out there? Is your church contributing to that? To helping those people? And that's like a formation program that's really deep and really rich and thick. And it has implications for public justice too. Like one story I often like to tell. I'm a huge Dorothy Sayers fan. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's one of the Inklings, and she wrote a lot on theology and stuff. But she also writes these really great murder mystery novels, which for me are her greatest bits of writing. And there's a character in that book, and I'm waxing, Dennis. You cut me off if I'm stuff, but I got a point that I'm trying to make here. Her name is Miss Clemson, and she's a sort of a spinster, what people would call a spinster. She's a 55 or something year old unmarried woman, who's busy though, who's working, who's doing. She's often helping the detective Peter Wimsey. And there's a scene in one of the books, I think it's called Strong Poison. There's a scene where she's on a jury that is weighing judgment on a young woman who's been accused of murdering somebody by poison. And at the time, the death penalty was present. So if there's a guilty verdict, she's going to be hung from the gallows. This young woman who's been accused, and Miss Clemson is part of this jury. And there's a scene where everyone's like, you know what, we've heard enough. She's guilty, and Miss Clemson's like, nah, she's not. There's something missing here. There's something missing here. I don't think she's guilty, and I'm going to hold the line on that. And they're like, come on, Miss Clemson. It's almost lunchtime. Let's get this done and dusted so we can go eat a sandwich. Like, I'm starving. Let's get this done and dusted. It's done. It's very clear. Let's get it over with. And she's like, and I'm paraphrasing here. She says, you know what? I fast every Friday. And if you think I'm going to trade this young woman's life for a sandwich, you've got another thing coming, you bunch of wimps, right? Like, and so there's something there. I'm paraphrasing. Dorothy Sayers does a better job of it. But the point is, her everyday fasting on Friday prepared her to hold the line for justice, for life, for this young woman who's been falsely accused, And I think that that's a metaphor. Like, that's a metaphor for the rest of us Christians. We should be preparing our hearts, our minds, and our bodies to hold that line, to be able to give, to be able to sacrifice. And I think that's a high calling. That's one we're going to fail in often. We're going to fail in regularly. But if we're not doing that, we're betraying the nature of our hope. And so maybe that's the note on which I'll end.
I think that's a great way to end. And I think really what you're kind of talking about with formation is really something that I think in our society, there are two deficits in the church is a failure of discipleship. I think in our society, I don't know what that's like in Canada, but I know here is a failure of citizenship. And I think in both cases, it's that sense of being formed and realizing that this life is not just revolves around you, that it's about something beyond yourself. And I think that those are two things, a project that we have to kind of really focus on. And it's that formation both within the church and outside of the church as well.
Yeah, I'd say it's particularly true in democratic states, right? You're a Republican state, which is like, and we're a constitutional monarchy, but at the end of the day, we're democracies. And so we, as government for, by, and of, the people. And so it means the quality of the people and their virtue and their formation is critical and core. And I think, there's an increasing recognition that these democracies were built on principles that emerged from Christianity, the dignity of every human being, made in the image of God, which, a certain ontological equality, but also, I'm Reformed, also an equality of sin. There's a sense that, both you and I may be, people who try to be holy, but, at the end of the day, we're sinners. And that's true for everybody, whether you're the queen or king or whether you're the president. And that means you got to be checked. And that means you got to have structures around you that are checking you. And, so this is complicated. This is the sort of the rich fabric of constitutional democracies. And it's like, you gotta tend to it. You gotta tend to it. You gotta sow it. You gotta add to that weave. And, but I'm hopeful always.
And I think that is a good place to end. Brian, if people want to know more about you and Cardus and also Comment, where can they go?
So for Comment Magazine, they should go to comment.org and they should check it all out. It's just so good. I honestly, Dennis, think it's one of the greatest magazines out there, and I'm biased. My friend Ann Snyder is our editor-in-chief there. She's great. We have a great contributing editor board too, which I encourage you to check it all out. So comment.org, subscribe. And if you want to check out the work that Cardus does, that's the think tanky work, the more wonky policy work. We're based in Canada, but we do work in the States too on education and a number of other files. You can check us out at cardus.ca. So cardus.ca. And just browse and enjoy.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you so much for this really good discussion. That really wide ranging about kind of the role of Christians in our social witness and what that all means.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right.
So I'd like to thank Brian for taking the time to chat with me in this episode. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about this episode. Feel free, if you want, you can send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com to share your thoughts and concerns. I will also put links to Comment Magazine. As I said before, it's a good magazine. I hope that you will consider checking out the website and maybe even subscribing. One note that I did wanting to let you know is that I'm going to be emphasizing more that people to join my email list, partially just because as of in the past, I used to do a lot of promoting of these episodes on Facebook and Twitter, not calling it by the other name, and even some of the newer places like Blue Sky. But I'm kind of noticing these days that's usually not where things are at. People just don't look at links like they used to. Too much of social media now seems to be more about memes and I guess pretty much letting people know where you stand on whatever issue. So I'm trying to focus more on getting people, if they want to get the podcast or at least know when the podcast is available, to get that via email. I'm still working on getting that set up. I do have something currently set up on MailChimp, and but I think I may be moving to a different email marketing. So I will let you know when that happens, but I wanted to let you be aware of that. And I'm trying to move more towards that than to try to promote on social media, which kind of these days just doesn't seem to be working out. So just want to let you know about that. Also, if you want to learn more about the podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, you know where to check us out. That's churchandmain.org. Also, feel free to visit us at churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. The one that I have up there most recent is about the fact that I'm okay with saying that Jesus died for my sins. So check it out. Give it a good read. And I hope that you will consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And wherever you're listening, if it's a possibility to leave a rating or a review, I hope that you will consider doing that. It really helps others find the podcast. You can do that definitely on Apple Podcasts, but and other podcast platforms. So that is it for this episode of Church in Maine. Again, thank you so much for listening. My name is Dennis Sanders. I'm your host. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.